That was a lot of energy. That's good. We're going to take 4 weeks and work through the book of Ruth, which is a handy little book. There's 4 chapters, so 4 sermons. We do a chapter a week. So the book of Ruth, it's in the Old Testament. It's situated between Judges and 1 Samuel. And it kind of introduces David, and it provides sort of a buffer or an introduction between that time of the Judges into the 1 Samuel that introduces David and how Saul becomes king, and then David and all that story. But it also is sort of framed in a way as to kind of give legitimacy to David as king. So it kind of introduces David in a way. So it begins, it's a very literary book. Like as you read it, you sort of get a sense that somebody is telling a story. And it's written in such a way as a story, almost as a play in 4 acts. Each chapter has an opening and a closing, and then the next chapter begins the next act or the next scene. And so it begins as good stories do with an introduction. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. And so imagine yourself as a child or as a member of the community, and an elder in the community is telling this story. Because back in their time, everything was oral, right? It wasn't all written down like we have it. And so the stories were passed on orally. And so imagine yourself listening to the story, and it begins with an introduction like that. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem, from the tribe of Bethlehem, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live in the land of Moab. Now there's some stuff happening there that we'll get into that Israelite people would pick up on pretty quickly. For one thing, Bethlehem means house of bread. So there's a famine in the house of bread. Another thing, Moab was an enemy of Israel. But so it begins with this like engaging introduction, and then at the end of the book, it ends with, and then Naomi has a son, and he was from Boaz, the son who's the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. And so the story begins with this engaging introduction, but then it ends with this surprise, oh wow, this is a story about David. This is a story about the family of David, the most famous king of Israel. And so you can see how this is a story that's kind of introducing David, and it's saying here are some godly people that were part of David's family, that led up to David becoming the king that he was for the people of Israel. And then the final verses of the book give a 10 generation genealogy of David. So part of what's interesting about this is because of the mention of Moab. So Moabites, if you recall, I don't know if you know this, but in the story of Israel, Moab was an enemy of Israel. And so as they're journeying toward the promised land, they had to go through the land of Moab. And the Moabites, do you remember the story of Balaam, the guy with the talking donkey? Balaam was hired by the king of Moab to try to deceive the Israelites and to try to lead them away from the way of God. So there's this history that Israel has with Moab that's not a happy history. And all through the book of Judges, Moab are often the ones Gideon defeats the Moabites. The Moabites are the ones raiding Israel, keeping Israel in captivity. There's this animosity between them. There's a little note in the study Bible that says, set in the dark and bloody days of the Judges, the story of Ruth is silent about the underlying hostility and suspicion the 2 peoples, Judahites and Moabites, felt for each other. The original onslaught of the invading Israelite tribes against towns that were once Moabite had never been forgotten or forgiven. While the Hebrew prophets denounced Moab's pride and arrogance for trying to bewitch, seduce, and oppress Israel from the time of Balaam on, the Mesha stele from around 830 BC, a stele is like a stone or something where there's history recorded on it, boasts of the massacre of entire Israelite towns. So there's this animosity between these people. So the story begins that there's a famine in the house of bread, and an Israelite man from the tribe of Judah goes to Moab. And that's going to instantly trigger for Israelite people, wow, It must have been bad if they went to Moab. And so that's the setting. That's the place that this story is happening, the way that it's kind of opening up. And then as it unfolds, it's this, like I was saying, it's almost like a play, like a story that's being told in 4 scenes or 4 acts. So let's read chapter 1 together. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. Naomi means pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. "Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune against me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. End scene. That's a great ending to a scene, right? Like it's all just sort of wrapped up, but there's also this little clue that makes you want to read the next chapter. Just as the barley harvest was beginning, something's about to happen. We'll find out next week. Let's pray. Jesus, this little book has some cool stuff in it. But God, it's not going to make any difference in our life unless you, by your Spirit, work your truth into our hearts and into our lives. So speak to us today, I pray, through your word and through my simple words, and help us to grow in you, deeper in your love, deeper in our identity as your beloved sons and daughters. Amen. So one of the things that's interesting about the book of Ruth is that it's actually a story about Naomi. Somehow Ruth managed to get the title, the naming rights. But the story begins and ends with Naomi. It's framed with Naomi, and almost every chapter, every scene begins and ends with Naomi, with the exception of chapter 4, begins with Boaz. But the book begins with this opening scene about Elimelech and his family, and Naomi's right there. And then it ends, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth. And then chapter 2 begins, now Naomi had a relative, and it ends again with Naomi. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi, ends with Naomi. She's framing this entire story. It's really a story about what's happening in Naomi's life and what God is doing in Naomi's life through it. And Boaz and Ruth are major players in this story. We'll encounter them later. But today, I want to just talk about Naomi and what's happening in Naomi. Some people refer to Naomi as a female Job. That this is a book that grapples with questions about God just as Job did. Job grapples with questions about God's trustworthiness, God's ability to rescue, as Job loses everything and then wrestles with God about that. So does Naomi. Naomi loses everything. We see in 5 verses the complete unraveling of a life. Complete devastation for Naomi. Everything is gone. And throughout the book, she wrestles with God about this. Does God love me? Does God care about me? Is God good? These kinds of questions are not questions that Naomi only wrestles with. You and I have asked these questions. Our friends and neighbors ask these questions. So this is a story about Naomi and her experience of profound loss and then restoration and wrestling with God in the middle of that. So in 5 verses, 10 plus years are summed up. The house of bread has no bread. She moves to the land of her enemies. And this simple thing, we miss it. We miss the details of what's going on here, because for Elimelech and his sons and his wife to move to Moab, they are famine refugees in a hostile land. Just wrap your head around that for a minute. They're famine refugees in a hostile place. So they're not middle-class suburbanites just moving and getting a nice house in Moab. They are dirt poor, scrabbling to survive. And the best place they can think of to go is Moab. And they scrabble out a life in Moab. What must that have been like? I don't imagine it was great. And it doesn't tell us all of that, but you can just, if you use your imagination and you understand what's happening behind these simple statements, you can see how Naomi has just experienced something horrific. And she's trying to survive with her husband and her sons. And now she's in this hostile place and her husband dies. And in a world that's built on patriarchy, if the husband dies, you've lost your source of income, you've lost your safety. And so she's left with her sons to take care of her, to give her a future, to provide for her, to make sure she's safe. And then her sons die. And now 3 women are left alone. Now imagine also what kind of families would Orpah and Ruth have come from to marry famine refugees. Right? They weren't well-off Moabites either. So this is a story about marginalized peoples who are trying to survive and struggling and losing and losing and losing. They can have no children, they're barren, their husbands are gone, and now these 3 women are vulnerable with no income, no protection, famine refugees in a foreign land. And then they hear the house of bread has bread again. So maybe if we go back, it'll be better. Maybe if I go back home. But you can sense here, just in these 5 verses, the complete unraveling of Naomi's life, right? She's lost everything. She's lost income, protection, family, security, future, hope. And so she returns to Bethlehem and she blames God. She says in verses 11 and 13 and 20 to 21, God has caused her to suffer. God has abandoned her. God has afflicted me, she says. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because my life is bitter. She doesn't have any hope. Even going back to Bethlehem, maybe there's some family, maybe there's people that'll be friendlier to her, but she still has no income. She still has to try to find food, a place to live. But as we go through this book, we begin to see how God sees Naomi. He notices her. He pays attention to her. She's not forgotten, even though she feels that way, right? God has abandoned me. But God hasn't abandoned her, and we begin to see that through the story as it unfolds. So at the end of chapter 2, Ruth returns from gleaning in the fields. And at the beginning of the chapter, Ruth says, maybe I should go glean in the fields so we can have some food. And that was a practice that was allowed by Israelite law. It was one of the ways that God had instructed the Israelites to care for the poor among them, that they weren't to harvest the corners of the field, and if they dropped grain on the ground, they just leave it there so the poor can come behind and pick up a little bit of grain and have some food. It was their sort of welfare system. And so Naomi is just bitter and lost in her own grief and sorrow and angst. And Ruth is the one who suggests, maybe I can go glean in the fields. And Naomi says, sure, go ahead. And through chapter 2, we'll talk about this next week, we encounter a scene where Ruth experiences some hard things in that field. But through Boaz's generosity and kindness and provision, she comes back with her arms full of grain. And at the end of the chapter, Naomi is overwhelmed and astounded that God would provide for them in this kind of way. And we see in chapter 3 how Naomi's perspective begins to shift. After she has experienced God seeing her in the middle of her struggle, and as she begins to experience God caring for her in the middle of her loss, her perspective changes. And now in chapter 3, she's thinking more about Ruth's needs. And she says, Ruth, we need to find you a home. And she begins to put things into action to try to get Ruth to be able to marry again and have a family and a home to be provided for. She begins to shift from that inward kind of place where you're curled up upon yourself with the grief and the loss and the sorrow and God has abandoned me and everything is horrible. And she begins to open up and turn and think about someone other than herself. And that's a response that Naomi had to God's grace and kindness in her life. She received God's provision for her, and the response then is to be able to think about others. So Naomi begins to grow through this story. She begins to change through this story, and the reason she changes is because God is compassionate and sees her in her difficulty and shows her that he hasn't forgotten her. And by the end of the story, everything's different. Ruth and Boaz have a baby boy. But the story doesn't end saying Ruth has a son. It ends saying Naomi has a son. Naomi, who was lost everything, now has family again. Has children again. And in a world where your worth as a woman is measured by your ability to bear children, that means everything. So by the end, she's got a community who's pointing out her blessings. She comes in saying to the community, I'm bitter, call me Mara. God has afflicted me, I've lost everything. My life is horrible. And by the end, the community is now saying, Naomi, look what you have. You've got a daughter-in-law who takes care of you. You've got a son-in-law to provide for you. You've got a grandson to give you a future. A God who has included you in his plans to save the world. Because by the end of the story, we see what God is doing all along. That this woman who's lost everything, who's experienced tragedy and horrors that we probably can't imagine, has now been wrapped up in God's plan for all of us. The line of David, which leads us to Jesus. That's Naomi's story now. So God has taken her tragedy and he's wrapped it up in something. And changed her along the way so she can begin to see others and care about others. And now her sorrow and her suffering is wrapped up in a bigger story than her. And it's transformed in the process. It doesn't make it good or better, but it gives her hope. So along this story, along this journey that Naomi is taking in this story, we see God appearing in different kinds of ways. At first, God is silent to her suffering. 10 years wrapped up in 5 verses, and we don't see God doing much there. They run off to Moab. They're trying to just scrabble a life. What is God doing? But then as we follow the trajectory of the story, we see that God sees her suffering. God notices, God cares, God is compassionate, and he has a bigger plan at work that he wraps Naomi and Ruth up into. So I think part of what we can learn from this, or what we can take from this, is that God doesn't remove our suffering, but he works in us, through it, changing us, helping us to grow. And he enfolds it in his story of redeeming everything, of making all things new. It's a story of taking broken things and making them whole, not undoing all the brokenness, but transforming it. So where do we find ourselves here? Where are you today? I think we at times experience suffering. You have experienced hardship and difficulty in different ways. You've experienced tragedy and loss. And sometimes we, like Naomi, we blame God. We think our life is bitter. God has afflicted me. God has abandoned me. I know there's been times for me where I try to pray and it feels like it's just bouncing off the ceiling. It's not going anywhere. God is silent. I think we need reminded sometimes that God sees us. Even when we can't hear him or feel him or see him at work, God sees us. We aren't forgotten. We aren't lost to him. Even when we're in a foreign land. Even when we're somewhere else. God sees us in our suffering. And he works in us through those times, through those seasons, through those experiences. He can work in us to help us grow, to help us turn from that inward focus to an outward focus, where we can begin to reflect God's compassionate heart toward others. And then he wraps us up in his plan. He uses our suffering for good in our lives. It's often out of those places of pain that we can minister to the most to others, that we can speak into their experiences because we've been there. He uses our experiences to help us grow, and he wraps it up in what he's doing and redeeming everything. And so there's 2 challenges that I give you today. One is just to remember that God sees you wherever you are. If you're in the middle of suffering, if you feel like Naomi, my life is bitter, God has afflicted me, abandoned me. God sees you. God cares about you. And he wants to work in you through those experiences. But the second challenge is for us to be people like Naomi who grow, who begin to look outward. As we experience God's kindness toward us, that we begin to be people who can offer kindness to others. That we begin to be people like God who can see others in their suffering. Who can see the famine refugees, for example. Right? We live in a world that's increasingly polarized, where there's rising nationalism and the other is vilified, those who are different from us. So refugees and immigrants having a hard go finding a home. Can we be people who see others in their suffering, who notice them, and then who are moved to act, who are moved with compassion to provide for them, to care for them, to meet their needs? Because that's the kind of God we serve. And he wants us to grow from the experiences that we have of the grace and the kindness and the compassion that he pours out into our lives, to then offer that to others. So that's the challenge today. For really an invitation more than a challenge. I like invitations. They feel kinder. So the invitation is to know that God sees you. God cares about you. And then the second invitation is to be a person who sees others and cares for others. God, thank you for this story. Please continue to teach us as we dig into it in the next few weeks. As we go from here, Father, provide for us, care for us. Help us grow in our knowledge that we are loved and seen and cared for by you. Grow in us the capacity to care for others. Amen.